Have you ever believed in Bigfoot? Lorraine Pike, a 58-year-old widow, slipped and fell deep in the misty Shasta forest. When she woke, her leg was splinted, clean water by her side, and an old brass button from her late husband's uniform, who died over a decade ago. Most people would call that impossible, but someone, or something, in the forest had saved her, left wild berries, herbs, little gifts, then vanished silently into the trees. This isn't a tale of monsters. It's a story of silent guardians, and what happens when greed tries to hunt them down. Based on true events from Weaverville in the early 1990s, this is a side of Bigfoot you've never seen, one of care, of memory, of quiet hands in the dark, and a small town that chose silence to protect something sacred. But before we begin, where are you watching from? Could this story echo from our forests to yours? If this touched something in you, like it did for us, hit like, subscribe, and help us build a community that believes not all legends need to be proven. Some are meant to be protected. Spring 1991. Weaverville, California. The old postal truck grumbled its way up a gravel switchback, headlights pushing through the mist like tired eyes searching for something lost. Lorraine Pike, 58, hunched over the wheel, her fingers gripping it tight enough to turn the knuckles white. The heater rattled but blew no warmth. A half-empty thermos clinked beside a box of bundled mail, and taped to the dashboard was a faded photo of her husband, Bill, in his forestry uniform, mid-laugh. She glanced at it like she always did, then looked away just as quick. Fog sat heavy on the mountain like a secret no one dared say out loud. "You still hear me up there, huh?" Lorraine said, her voice rough, not from age, but from mornings like this. Cold, damp, too quiet. "Still got your old route, Bill. Ain't that something?" No one answered but the forest. She turned a bend near Trinity Pines, gears growling in protest. The tires skidded slightly on the wet rock, but she kept going. These roads weren't new to her. She'd been on them half her life. Some of the boxes were barely used anymore. Cabins shut for the season, folks moved or gone, but she delivered just the same. Routine was sacred. Even if it meant lying about her blood sugar levels, stuffing candy in her glove box, and hiding insulin shots in the back of the pantry so the county doctor wouldn't pull her license. If they took away her truck, they'd take the last piece of him. The rain had started soft, barely noticeable, just a whisper across the windshield. But by the time she hit the trailhead near Bear Gulch, it had turned mean. Slanted sheets. She pulled over, engine idling. One box left, up an old trail the truck couldn't reach. She sat there for a moment, hand resting on the door handle, then let out a breath that fogged the glass. "Let's get this over with." Boots hit the mud, already sinking. She slung the leather mailbag across her shoulder, pulled the hood of her jacket tight, and started up the path. The trees closed around her like a slow exhale, and the trail narrowed, winding like something that had forgotten it was supposed to be walked. She should have turned back, but she didn't. A stone gave way beneath her left boot, and her ankle twisted hard. She gasped, reaching for a sapling, missed, and fell, sharp and sudden, down a shallow embankment. There was a sickening crack, and then white. Not pain yet, just white, like the sound had sucked the world dry. When she opened her eyes, it was dark. Rain had stopped. Or maybe she was somewhere it couldn't reach. Her body throbbed in waves. She tried to move and cried out, ankle on fire. She was lying on something soft, not soil, rags, blankets. Her hand brushed something dry and mossy. Her coat was gone, replaced by an old sleeping bag zipped halfway. She blinked up. Rough stone ceiling, a low dome, a shallow cave. The scent of wet cedar and iron filled the air. Someone had made a fire here. Not now. Recently. The ashes still held a whisper of heat. Next to her, a battered metal cup, half full of water. 2 hard biscuits on a folded cloth. A strip of dried meat. her breath caught in her throat. She looked down. Her ankle, swollen purple, was wrapped carefully in strips of what had once been her jacket, bound with twine and small, straight branches. The work was precise, not rushed, not wild. She wasn't alone. At the cave's mouth a figure stood, massive, too tall for any man she knew. Shoulders like a bear's, but the posture too still, too composed. The silhouette turned, just slightly, as if to check that she was awake. No face, just shape, presence. And then it stepped back into the mist. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around the realization that something, someone, had carried her here, dressed her wound, and left her food and water without expecting thanks, and hadn't spoken a single word. Lorraine stayed there through the night, awake, listening. Every now and then, a soft knock, wood on wood, echoed from somewhere beyond the trees. Not an owl, not a branch falling, steady, intentional. In the morning, pale light filtered through the trees. She was alone. The food was gone. The cup, too, like it had all been cleared out before dawn. Her ankle ached, but she could move, just enough. Gritting her teeth, she pulled herself upright, wrapped the blanket tight, and hobbled to the mouth of the cave. She expected to see nothing. But the path had been swept clear of debris. Someone wanted her to find her way back. It took her hours to make it down the mountain. She used a broken branch as a crutch, stopping often. Every step was a bite. When she finally reached the truck, the storm had passed, and the clouds were pulling apart like curtains. She sank into the driver's seat, shaking. That's when she saw it. Sitting in the center of the dash, tucked beneath the faded photo of her husband, was a single brass button, tarnished but still legible. The old postal emblem etched into its face, eagle in flight, shield beneath it. It had belonged to Bill. He'd worn it on his winter coat, the one he'd been buried in. She had no memory of taking it with her. None. Lorraine held it in her hand for a long while, thumb brushing over the familiar ridges. She didn't cry, but something in her chest gave. The road home passed through the southern edge of Trinity Forest. The ruts were deeper than usual. At first, she didn't think much of it, just runoff from the storm. But then she spotted the sawdust, fresh, piled like drift at the base of a young cedar, and tire marks, not her own, wider, heavier. She pulled over, climbed down slow, heart pounding in that same hush she'd felt in the cave. The stump had been cut clean. No marker, no tag. Whoever did this hadn't come through any legal route. She crouched, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and brushed a finger through the sawdust. Still damp, still warm. Something was happening in those woods. Not just logging, not just erosion, something more deliberate. And if she hadn't fallen, if she hadn't been carried to that cave, she never would have seen it. By the time she made it home, the sky had turned soft again. The kind of pale gold that slips through pine needles and rests on old porches. Her house sat quiet at the edge of town. A flag hung still on the post. A pair of boots by the door that hadn't been worn in years. She eased herself inside, set the mailbag down, and limped to the kitchen. Boiled water for tea she wouldn't finish. Sat in Bill's old chair, the one with the armrest rubbed raw from his hand. The brass button sat in her palm like a small sun. She didn't know what she believed anymore, but she knew what she'd felt. And somewhere out there, something was watching, not with menace, not with fear, just watching. Lorraine set the button on the windowsill, next to a potted plant long dead. The wind shifted. A hush moved through the pines. She thought for just a moment. She could hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving back into the trees. Not crashing, not fleeing, just going, like someone who had delivered something important and had no need to be seen again. The tea had gone cold, but she didn't move. Outside, the sky deepened, the light fading just enough for the porch shadows to stretch long across the grass. And in that stillness, Lorraine Pike, mail carrier of Weaverville, sat alone in her home. Not afraid, not anymore, just listening. for whatever might come next, or knock. The lake had that early summer hush to it, the kind where birdsong felt cautious and the surface held still, like it remembered something. Lorraine stood near the edge of Lewiston Lake, holding her thermos with both hands. Her ankle throbbed inside the brace, hidden by a pair of stiff brown boots she hadn't worn in years. The ones Bill used to tease her about, army boots for the post office, but they held firm on uneven ground. The wind brushed the water in small pulses, barely rippling the mirror of pine trees across the far bank. She hadn't planned on telling anyone. Not a word. Not about the cave, not about the food, the water, or the massive figure that had vanished into fog. But secrets had weight, and hers had begun to ache right between her shoulders. Marta Penfield was the only person she trusted with that kind of weight. The retired nurse still kept her red Ford wagon spotless, parked at the end of a gravel lane rimmed in foxglove and iris. Her house smelled like wood polish and peppermint tea, and her voice always came out in a hush, like every sentence might be the last someone hears before passing. She listened without blinking as Lorraine laid it all out. The fall, the shelter, the button, the shape at the cave mouth. She didn't laugh. She didn't ask if Lorraine hit her head. Instead, she said, "The forest remembers who walks it with respect." Lorraine didn't quite know what that meant, but the way Marta said it made her stomach tighten. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a breeze passed through the chimes on the porch. "You remember the old willow above Hennessy Creek?" Marta asked. "The one with the rope swing. My brother carved his initials into that tree in '58. When the fire came through in '76, that was the only thing left standing. Whole hill turned to ash, but not that tree. Not even a scorch mark." Lorraine sipped her tea, watching steam rise like a spirit in the air. Marta leaned forward. "If you ever go back, don't bring a map. Don't mark anything down. Remember it up here." She tapped her temple gently. "The wrong kind of people find the wrong kind of things when there's a trail to follow." That night, Lorraine placed the brass button in a small wooden box, the one she kept her wedding ring in after Bill passed. She slid it under the bed, then stood at the window, watching the trees bend in the wind like old men whispering. The next morning, the door to the Weaverville Gazette jingled open as Tessa Holt stepped inside, a manila envelope under one arm. The air inside smelled like ink and stale coffee, but she didn't seem to mind. She moved like someone trying to take up less space than she had, eyes darting to the editor's office, then back to the developing room. Tessa had come from Eureka, taking a summer internship no one wanted. She was 23 and still carried herself like a girl trying to prove something. The camera she wore crossbody was battered, secondhand, wrapped in tape and stickers that had faded under too much rain. She didn't talk much, but she watched everything. The dark room was silent except for the drip of chemicals and the low buzz of the ventilation fan. She pulled the photos from the drying line one by one, brows furrowed. Most were nothing. Birds in flight, fallen trunks, old logging gear left to rot. But one stopped her. It showed a burned stump near Whiskey Ridge, taken just after a lightning fire 2 weeks ago. In the far left of the frame, caught mid-crouch, was something. Not quite a man, not quite an animal. Broad-shouldered, hunched low, arms impossibly long. No visible face, just shadow and shape. But the posture, gentle, almost reverent, as if it were studying the charred remains of the tree. Tessa stared at it for a long time. Then she slipped the photo into her bag, alone. By noon, the town had begun to hum with unease. Not because of what Tessa saw, not yet, but because of what Russell Bain had said that morning at the diner. He stood near the coffee machine, chest puffed like always, declaring the town would soon get a new economic lifeline. "A road's gonna cut straight through the reserve line," he'd said, stirring sugar into his mug. "Bring jobs, real ones, no more waiting on tourist crumbs." No one said much back, but everyone heard it. Lorraine sat at her usual booth, toast untouched. Across from her, Abel Rory stirred his black coffee without looking up. His hands were still calloused from years of cutting trees. though he hadn't lifted an axe in over a decade. "That road's not for jobs," he muttered. "It's for control. Once you move the markers, the rest is paper." "You think he'll do it?" she asked. "I think he already has." At dusk, something knocked 3 times on Lorraine's back porch. Not loud, not threatening, just clear. She stepped out with a flashlight, its beam shaky over the wet boards. Nothing, no footprints. But there, resting neatly atop the old cooler, was a small bundle of leaves tied with twine. Lamb's ear, narrow-leaf plantain, bone set, all of them herbs, all of them used for swelling and bruising. She knelt, fingers trembling as she picked up the bundle. Whoever brought it had known, had watched. And still, no one came forward. At the Gazette, Tessa enlarged the photo, printed it twice. One copy she stashed in her notebook. The other she left on the editor's desk with a yellow sticky note. Unidentified figure near Whiskey Ridge fire site. She didn't expect it to run. By Friday, murmurs had taken root. The hunters at the supply store whispered about deer carcasses gone missing, stripped clean. Campers said their coolers had been opened, but nothing taken, just shifted. Rearranged, almost politely. Kids started daring each other to go into the woods at dusk. And Evan, Lorraine's grandson, broke the silence at the dinner table, talking about a shadow he'd seen near the edge of the blueberry patch. "It wasn't a bear," he said, serious in that way only 8-year-olds can be. "It stood up when I saw it, like a person, but big, real big." Lorraine felt her fork pause halfway to her mouth. "What did it do?" "It held out its hand. What did you do?" "I gave it a berry, and then it gave me one too." She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was scared, but because she wasn't. She sat at the kitchen table long after Evan had gone to bed. The house dim except for the lamp above the sink. The woods outside had their own rhythm, their own language, and someone was speaking it. As Saturday morning cracked open with low fog and the smell of pine resin, smoke began to rise beyond the ridgeline. Thin at first, then darker. Lorraine pulled on her jacket and boots without thinking, radio buzzing with chatter. A fire had started near the old mill site. By the time she reached the overlook, flames were climbing fast, chewing through dry timber like it had been waiting for this chance. Volunteers scrambled with hoses and shovels, but what caught her eye, what stopped her breath, was the figure near the flames. Broad shoulders, long arms, draped in something dark and soaked. It pulled a tarp, heavy, wet, stained, over a pile of felled logs stacked like tinder, shielding them, turning its back to the fire, not running, not fleeing, fighting. She couldn't see a face, just motion, but that was enough, because somewhere inside, she knew, whatever had helped her in the cave, whatever had left the herbs, whatever had exchanged berries with her grandson, it hadn't left. It was still here, still watching, still protecting something far older than fences or deeds or promises. And whatever was coming next, whatever Russell Bain and his crew thought they could take, was going to be met with more than just protest signs or town hall meetings. It would be met with silence, with shadow, with something built of muscle and memory and moss-covered hands that remembered who had hurt the forest, and who had helped. The heat had settled over Mill Creek Canyon like a wool blanket soaked in sun. It was the kind of midsummer weight that made the air feel thick, even in the shade, and drew sweat out of the skin before a body had time to move. Lorraine Pike leaned against the side of Cole Jensen's battered pickup, one boot resting on the running board. Her eyes narrowed toward the tree line. The sound of insects buzzed low and constant, like static beneath the world. Abel Rory stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched behind a gray-streaked beard. He hadn't spoken much since they parked, just scanned the clearing like he was looking for something he hoped not to find. Cole kicked at the dust with the toe of his boot, hands on his hips. "You sure it's here?" Lorraine nodded once. Saw it clear as day, fresh sawdust, wide tracks. Didn't look like county work. Abel motioned toward a broken cedar sapling lying flat at the edge of the trail. "That wasn't like that last time I came through." They started walking, the three of them moving single file into the woods where the light broke through in fractured beams. Lorraine's ankle ached, but she didn't say a word. Every footstep reminded her of the button, the cave, and the quiet watcher she still hadn't spoken of to anyone but Marta. The deeper they went, the more wrong things looked. Survey markers had been pulled. Not broken, removed, deliberately. Some spots had been covered over with leaves, others tamped down with the flat side of a boot. And that's when they saw the first stump. Not old, not rotted, smooth cut, clean as a sawmill job. Abel crouched, running his fingers across the surface. No ring burn, no rot. This tree was standing last week. Cole knelt beside him, brushing away a layer of pine needles. There's no tag, no permit flag. Somebody's working off the record. Lorraine moved slower now. Something about the quiet here wasn't natural. No birds, no squirrel chatter. Just the sound of their boots and the occasional creak of bark in the heat. At a narrow bend along a branch of the creek, they stopped. A wide log, old but hollow, had fallen across the trail. Cole stepped on it without thinking and gave it a playful kick. It rang out sharp and deep, like hitting the side of a drum. Then it answered. 3 beats, soft, precise. Not echo, not animal. A reply. They froze. Cole turned slowly, eyes wide. Tell me you heard that. Lorraine didn't move. Hit it again. He did. Once. Silence. Twice. Silence. 3 times. The sound came back. But further this time, fainter, like someone or something was moving. Abel stood straight. They're warning us, not chasing us off. Just letting us know they're there. The 3 of them didn't say another word until they reached the stream where the moss grew thick and cold against the rock. They turned back. By the time they returned to the truck, the light had shifted. The sun dipped behind the ridge and shadows stretched across the trail like fingers. Lorraine looked down the slope, toward the thickets of wild blueberry bushes. Then she saw Evan. He shouldn't have been there. He was supposed to be at home with Marta, playing cards or eating ice pops. But there he was, barefoot, sun on his face, crouched low near the brush, and just beyond him, a shape. Not hiding, not lunging, still, broad, towering, covered in brownish-red fur that caught the late sun like dust on glass. Evan's hand reached forward slowly, holding a single ripe berry. The shape responded, not with a growl or a sound, but by mirroring the gesture. An arm, long and powerful, stretched out with something dark in its palm. Another berry. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the trade happened, quiet and without fear. Evan took the berry. The shape took his. And then it stepped back, fading behind the thickets like mist off a cold river. Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. Abel whispered, "Don't spook him." Evan turned, saw them watching, and grinned like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I didn't talk to it," he said, "but I think it heard me." They didn't speak of it in the truck, not right away. Lorraine held his hand tight the whole ride down the canyon. Her mind raced, but not with panic. More like reverence, like she'd just seen a ritual older than fences or borders or even language. They dropped Evan off without a word to Marta about what they'd witnessed. She'd ask, but not now. As dusk crept across the hills and shadows returned to the streets of Weaverville, a siren wailed once from the far side of town. Then smoke, not a chimney, not a grill, a thick, dark plume rising fast from the direction of the old timber staging yard just beyond the ridge. By the time Lorraine reached the overlook, fire crews were already scrambling. The site was a mess. Logs stacked like pickup sticks, half covered with sheets of blackened plastic, flames licking upward like tongues starving for breath. But something moved inside the chaos, a massive shape, low to the ground, dragging a soaked canvas tarp over the nearest stack of dry timber. It moved with purpose, strength, and care. She knew those shoulders, that stillness. It pulled the tarp across the burning edge, smothering the flames enough for the crew to hit it with foam. Then it disappeared, again, into the smoke. One of the firemen shouted, "Did you see that?" Another, "It wasn't a bear. I swear it wasn't a bear." Someone else laughed nervously. "Too much heat. You're seeing things?" Lorraine didn't say anything. She just stood at the edge, heart pounding in rhythm with the siren still whining somewhere below. She could feel it, bone deep. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to burn the evidence, burn the trail, burn the silence. But something else had stepped in, not to stop them, to protect what couldn't speak, to protect the forest itself. And for the first time in her life, Lorraine understood that the woods weren't just alive. They had memory, they had will, and they had allies. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did Abel or Cole. They knew now they weren't alone in this. And somewhere, out past the reach of light and law, someone else had taken notice. Not just the watchers in the trees, but the ones with machines, with plans, with signatures forged on permits no one had a right to sign. Whatever was coming, it had already begun. And whatever they chose next, silence or speech, safety or risk, would echo longer than any trail marker ever could. The banners had been strung from the lampposts since Tuesday, red and yellow triangles that fluttered without commitment in the wind. By Thursday, the high schoolers had finished setting up the folding stages and hay bales around the gazebo. And by Friday morning, Main Street was already blocked off with orange cones and creaky wooden barricades. Someone had spray-painted "Happy Summer" in shaky letters across. Weaverville's summer jubilee had never been anything grand, but it was tradition, and in small towns, tradition was sometimes the only thing standing between people and the unraveling. Lorraine Pike stood behind a booth selling peach preserves and knitted potholders she hadn't made, watching the crowd drift like dandelion seeds along the street. Somewhere, a child squealed with laughter. Somewhere else, a band warmed up with out-of-tune banjo chords and a harmonica that screamed more than it sang. The air smelled like kettle corn and diesel from the backup generator. She scanned the crowd out of habit now, not just curiosity, not just loneliness. Her eyes caught on familiar figures. Sheriff Walt Hargrove standing stiff with a paper plate in one hand, Abel with his arms crossed near the dunk tank, Cole pacing with a half-eaten corn dog, always watching the tree line like it might move. Nothing had been the same since the fire. Russell Bain had made his move that morning. He took the stage near the pie-eating contest, microphone squealing before settling into his syrupy tone. "The good folks of this town deserve better," he said, all teeth and polish. "We can't live on folklore and postcards forever. The new road will bring work, new traffic, new opportunity. No more living in fear of stories told around campfires." He paused, letting the words settle, then added, louder, "And no more threats to our children's safety. That thing in the woods, whatever it is, it's a danger. The fire proved it." People clapped. Some just because others did. Lorraine stood still. Behind her, Pastor Elena Crow stepped up onto the church's front step, microphone in hand. Not part of the program. Her white linen blouse caught the sun and glowed soft like moth wings. She didn't raise her voice. "God made every living thing on this earth, not just the ones we understand, not just the ones we find pretty. Some heads turned, some turned away." Elena kept going. "Some creatures aren't meant to be studied or controlled. Some are meant to be left alone, and some are messengers." Russell scoffed, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Messengers? You're preaching fairy tales, Elena." She stepped down, folded her mic cord in her hands, and walked past him without a glance. No one clapped, but no one laughed either. The town didn't know which story to believe anymore. By late afternoon, the games had begun. Three-legged races, watermelon eating. The sheriff stood near the prize wheel, nodding at familiar faces, but his hand kept brushing the radio at his hip. Evan had been quiet all day. He trailed Lorraine like a shadow, not asking for candy or soda, not running toward the booths. She finally crouched and asked, "You all right, baby?" He looked at her with the solemn weight only children carried. "I told them." "Who?" "My friends, about the giant, about the berry." Her chest tightened. "I didn't mean to. They dared me. I thought maybe it was okay." She smoothed his hair, forced a smile. "Sometimes, when we see something special, our hearts get too full to keep it inside. But now they all know," he said. Even Hunter's mom was asking if it had a name. That night, long after the sun dipped behind the ridges, the crowd gathered for fireworks. They sprawled out across the ball field on quilts and lawn chairs, sipping beer from plastic cups. kids waving glow sticks like wands. The sky was clear, moon high and watching. Lorraine sat beside Evan on an old army blanket, watching the first burst of red and gold crack open above them. Then a sound came that didn't belong. Not fireworks. A sharp report. A single gunshot, echoing from the trees behind the school. For a second, no one moved. Then people started shouting. Lorraine was already running before she realized she'd stood up. Her boots hit gravel, then grass, then the soft mulch of forest edge. By the time she reached the tree line, the sound of celebration had crumbled behind her. She didn't know what she'd find, but what she saw made her stop cold. Leaves torn, branches snapped, and in the mud, half hidden beneath pine needles, a spent casing. Next to it, something small, a shell of a different kind. A rifle magazine gleaming faint under the moon, engraved with the initials RB. She dropped to her knees, touched the earth where the grass had been flattened in the shape of something fallen. A dark smear curved along the roots. Thick, still wet, but it wasn't human. Not with that scent. Not with that depth of color. Not with the way the earth seemed to hum around it like it had swallowed a secret. She sat back on her heels, the fireworks still screaming behind her, the town roaring in awe and laughter, completely unaware of what had just happened on the edge of their celebration. Something had been shot, something that had saved her, something that had trusted her grandson with a berry. She felt the dread crawl up the base of her spine like a cold hand, because she knew now this wasn't just fear talking in a crowd. Russell Bain had pulled a trigger, and whatever it had hit wasn't gone yet. But it had been hurt, and the woods would not forget. Rain had started before dawn, a soft tapping on the tin roof that turned steady and hard by mid-morning. It rolled through Trinity Basin like a warning, soaking pine needles, swelling creek beds, turning the red clay paths into slick ribbons of mud. Lorraine stood at the edge of the porch in her raincoat, the old canvas one Bill used to wear, her breath clouding in front of her face as she looked toward the ridgeline. The wound in the woods hadn't gone quiet since the shot. There was a current under the usual stillness now, like the trees were holding their breath. Abel had shown up with a grim nod and a muddy backpack slung over his shoulder. Cole was already in the truck, tapping the steering wheel in a rhythm that didn't match the rain. Evan insisted on coming too. At first, Lorraine said no, but the look in his eyes, steady, calm, older than it should have been, made her hesitate. He didn't say he'd seen the creature again. He didn't have to. He just looked at her the way Bill used to when he wanted her to understand something he couldn't put into words. The drive was slow. Fog clung to the trees like spiderwebs. The windshield wipers fought to keep up, squeaking every few seconds. No one spoke much. The road to the basin was a mess. Deep grooves where someone's tires had churned through before them. Water pooled in spots too wide to straddle. They had to leave the truck near the old logging trail and walk the rest of the way, boots sinking with every step. Lorraine kept her eyes low, scanning for tracks, for anything. But it was Evan who spotted it first. Just off the path, where the undergrowth thinned near a cluster of blackened tree trunks, was a splash of dark red against the wet rock. Not fresh, but not old either. Cole knelt beside it, touched it with the tip of his fingers, then nodded once. They were close. The mouth of the cave wasn't obvious. It was a shallow indentation behind a curtain of hanging moss, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But the smell was what gave it away. Earth, old ash, something coppery just beneath it. Lorraine pushed aside the moss and stepped in first. The light shifted. Everything inside the cave was gray-blue, the kind of dim that made you whisper even when you didn't mean to. The walls were rough, damp to the touch. Water dripped somewhere deeper in, and there, curled in the far corner, half covered by a torn canvas sack and a mound of moss and bark, was the shape. It was bigger than she remembered. Shoulders hunched, chest rising and falling in slow, strained breaths. One arm lay limp across its body, fur matted and slick with blood near the shoulder. The wound wasn't fresh, but it wasn't healing either. Beside it, almost hidden, was a smaller figure. Not child-sized, not adult. Somewhere in between. Its fur was darker, less patchy. Its posture tighter, coiled in a way that said fear, not sleep. Lorraine didn't move. Neither did the others. Evan stood just behind her, barely breathing. Then the smaller figure opened its eyes. Amber, wide, focused. It didn't growl, didn't run. It just looked. And Lorraine looked back. Slowly she stepped forward, pulled off the outer layer of her coat, and knelt. She reached into her pack and pulled out a rolled sweater, Bill's old wool one, then laid it gently over the massive chest of the injured one. The wet fur soaked it almost instantly. Still, she left it there like a gesture, like warmth was more than just heat. Abel moved next. He didn't say a word, just set down his bag, pulled out a tin of crushed willow bark, and knelt beside the shoulder. He dipped a cloth into a thermos of hot water, then began to clean the wound in slow, careful circles. The creature didn't flinch, but its breath quickened, nostrils flaring. Cole worked fast. He'd brought a roll of oilcloth and strips of bandage he used for tractor hoses. He looped them tight around the shoulder, binding the arm across the chest to keep it from moving. Lorraine held the creature's other hand while they worked. Its fingers curled loosely around hers. Too many knuckles, too much bone, but warm. When they finished, Lorraine looked at the smaller one. It hadn't moved, but now it held something in its palm, a brass button. She didn't recognize it at first. Then Evan stepped forward, pulled something from his coat pocket. A second button. The same eagle, the same shield. He held it out. The young one stared for a beat, then reached forward and placed its button gently into Evan's palm. They had exchanged something again, but this time it wasn't just berries. It was trust. They stayed a while longer, checking the dressings, replacing the soaked sweater with a layer of dry rags. The big one never opened its eyes, but it never recoiled either. When they stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. The trail back down was slick and quiet, and just before they reached the ridge, it happened. Abel stepped wrong. The snap of wire cut the air like a whip. A steel trap leapt from the mud, catching his ankle with a sharp, sickening crack. He went down hard, yelling in a voice Lorraine hadn't heard in years. Cole lunged forward, pried the jaws open with a rusted crowbar he'd been carrying since the fire. Lorraine pulled Abel back, both of them slick with mud and blood. Evan stood frozen, hands clenched. They didn't have time to argue. Lorraine wrapped his leg in the same oilcloth they'd used minutes ago. Cole cut branches for a makeshift crutch. They moved slow, every breath heavy, every sound louder now, because someone had set that trap, and someone would come back to check it. And now there were prints. Human, small, large, dragging, limping. The secret was no longer buried beneath ferns and moss and silence. They'd left pieces behind. Blood, fabric, memory. The forest had seen it all. And someone else would too. Lorraine didn't speak the rest of the way home. She kept her hand on Abel's shoulder, steadying him. And when she looked back toward the ridge, the trees swayed. Not in the wind, but in rhythm, like they were listening, or warning, or waiting. And night came down fast, like a door being shut from the outside. The storm came in early, an hour before sunset, sky bruised purple, thunder muttering like a threat that hadn't made up its mind. It rolled across the basin slow, not loud yet, but heavy. Rain hadn't started, but the air was thick with it, pressed close to the ground like something watching. Lorraine knew that smell, the metallic edge of wet pine and dust lifting before the first drop. She stood at the back entrance of Trinity Chapel, holding the door for Abel as Cole helped him inside. Abel moved slow, face pinched, the splint wrapped tight around his ankle. They hadn't dared take him to the clinic. Too many questions. Too many people connected to the wrong men. Inside, the pews were mostly empty. Just those who'd already seen too much. Elena Crow stood at the front of the sanctuary, hands folded, waiting in silence. Marta sat beside the aisle with a notebook in her lap. Tessa leaned against the back wall, camera tucked away. No lens between her and this moment. Lorraine closed the door behind them. The hush in the room was deeper than quiet. Not morning, not yet, but close. Pastor Elena looked up. "We'll keep it simple," she said. "This doesn't leave here unless we agree it does." She didn't have to explain. Everyone understood the stakes. Lorraine began with the story. The fall, the cave, the bandaged ankle. She told it plainly, without flourish. When she got to the part about the button, she let her voice falter for just a second before continuing. Then came the exchange in the blueberry patch, the healing, the second button, the trap. Cole filled in details about the wound, how the bullet had passed through but left infection behind. Abel described the way the creature breathed in the dark, as if every inhale cost it something. No one interrupted, not once. When they finished, Tessa stepped forward, pulled a folded paper from her bag. It was a printed copy of a scanned invoice, fuel delivery slips signed by the county office. She laid them out on the communion table, one by one. "Same signature," she said. "Same date, but the trucks never came." She looked to Cole. He nodded. "Bain's been pumping diesel straight from a side tank behind the mill. He's not just cutting trees. He's doing it on someone else's land. Land that used to be protected under a conservation lease." Marta opened her notebook and read off a line. "The original boundaries were filed in '72. The new map shows them moved by almost a quarter mile." "That's federal land," Abel said, voice low. "And no one noticed?" "No one was supposed to," Cole answered. Elena took a breath. "We need more than suspicion. We need proof." That's when Tessa spoke again. "There's someone," she said. "He came to me at the paper, said he was from the State Environmental Bureau, but his press badge was fake. He knew things he shouldn't about the camera traps, about the old sightings. He said if I could get Bain to admit it, even once, he'd make sure the story went statewide." "What does he want in return?" Lorraine asked. Tessa shook her head. "Nothing. He said the story's bigger than us." Elena looked around the room. "Then we give it to him." The lights flickered once as the first crack of thunder broke outside. The windows rattled. Rain hit the roof in a sudden burst. Lorraine stood and crossed to the side table where the tea urn had gone cold. She didn't pour a cup. She just stared out the narrow window at the line of trees swaying against the storm. "We're running out of time," she said. Elena joined her, speaking softly. "The forest won't wait forever. It's not just watching anymore. It's responding." Marta turned the page of her notebook, fingers shaking slightly. "I've been keeping track. Every sighting, every sound. They've grown more frequent, more urgent." Abel leaned forward in his seat, face pale. "It's because of me," he said. 30 years ago, I cut down a redwood in the old basin. It was marked sacred on the local registry, but I didn't care. I needed the payout. That same night, I heard knocking. 3 times, every night for weeks. Then it stopped, until now." He looked at Lorraine. "I think I woke something that should have stayed quiet." Outside, the wind screamed through the gutters. Tessa moved toward the altar and laid down a recorder. "We need to get Bain on tape. You won't change him with reason, but he can't help himself when he thinks he's already won." Lorraine stepped away from the window, her voice even. "Then let him think he has." The plan came together in murmurs. They'd draw him in, let him brag, let him gloat, get it all down, and when the time came, they'd make it public. But no one said what they feared, that by then it might be too late. As they packed up, Elena offered to walk Lorraine to her truck. Rain had slowed, but the ground squished beneath their boots. "You okay?" Elena asked. Lorraine hesitated, then said, "No, but I'm clear." She looked up at the trees bending in the wind. "Something's coming, and whatever it is, it's not going to wait for us to be ready." That night, the wind howled through the eaves of Lorraine's house like it was searching for a way in. She sat on the edge of her bed, button box open in her lap. Evan slept down the hall, one hand wrapped around a carving he'd found in the woods, smooth, palm-sized, shaped like an acorn but heavier than stone. Just past midnight, she heard it. Knocking, not loud, not near, but insistent. 3 times, then again, then faster, like something trying to be heard, or calling something awake. She got up, heart hammering, and opened the window. Mist clung to the trees like smoke, but nothing moved, and still, the knocking continued. Too distant to follow, too rhythmic to be chance. She didn't sleep, and in the morning, the wind had gone still. But every crow on the telephone wires was facing the same direction, watching, waiting, and somewhere, deep in the basin, something knocked again, but only once. This time, not a warning, but an invitation. The rain hadn't stopped. It hadn't even paused. By the time dusk began sinking into the spine of the Trinity Alps, the downpour had turned the roads to rivers and the gutters to waterfalls. Every shingle on every rooftop in Weaverville thrummed with it. Streetlights blinked through fog and water, casting halos in the storm. Inside Russell Lumber's main warehouse, the air reeked of oil and damp sawdust. The wind had forced its way through the high rafters, moaning across the corrugated metal like a low warning. Lorraine stood in the back seat of Cole's truck, staring through the windshield as the rain came down in sideways sheets. Abel was in the passenger seat, jaw locked, his crutch resting against the door. Tessa sat beside Lorraine in the back, hand wrapped tight around her recorder. None of them said a word. The warehouse loomed in front of them like a black box, a fortress lit from within by dim industrial lights and the occasional flicker of motion. This was it. Cole killed the engine. The truck ticked as it cooled, swallowed in the sound of water. He turned toward them, voice low. "We go in quiet. We get what we need. Then we get out." Lorraine opened her door and stepped into the mud. It sucked at her boots like it wanted her to stay. She pulled her coat tighter, glanced up at the roof line. The lights inside flickered once, briefly, like someone had touched the wrong wire. Then they steadied. The door to the side of the building was propped open with a 2x4. Someone had been careless. Or confident. Inside, the warehouse smelled of mold and rust. Old smoke and new lies. Water pooled beneath the racks of lumber, flowing in thin trails toward the rear loading docks. Boxes of saw blades, bolts, ratchet straps stacked to the ceiling. The sound of rain on the roof echoed like footsteps. They moved fast, ducking beneath a broken security camera that still blinked like it mattered. Lorraine led them past the break room, through a hallway lined with safety posters, until they reached the main office. The door was unlocked. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers half open like mouths mid-confession. A desk lamp burned low on a corner table beside a pile of maps, some old and yellowed, some fresh printed. Cole reached for the top one and unrolled it across the desk. Red lines, arrows, boundary markers. Tessa lifted her recorder and clicked it on. The light blinked red. "Start talking," she whispered. Cole pointed. "These markers don't match federal records. The road goes straight through the preserve. And look, there's a line that cuts directly toward the base of the basin." Abel limped to a nearby cabinet, yanked open the drawer labeled Archive, Site 9. Inside were photographs, time-stamped prints from camera traps. Most were empty frames, but a few showed shapes. Movement. One, too clear to be mistaken, captured a massive figure mid-stride, legs thick as tree trunks, arms swinging low, shoulders hunched. The eyes caught the flash and reflected back not red like an animal, but amber. Tessa stared at it. "We're not imagining this." Footsteps echoed from down the hall. All four froze. Lorraine flicked off the desk lamp. The hallway door creaked open. Voices. Rustles, louder than needed, laughing too hard. "Told them we were running dry. You think anyone in this county has the spine to check the tanks? Please, they're too busy arguing about ghosts in the trees." Another voice. "What about the, what'd you call it, wild man?" Russell scoffed. "That thing's just leverage. Fear sells. Blame the fires, the missing game, hell, even the trespassing on something with a myth behind it, and nobody asks real questions. You scare 'em enough. You get to build whatever the hell you want. Now drink up." A click. the hum of a cooler opening, cans hissing. Tessa pressed her recorder tight against the table. Cole's jaw tensed. Lorraine motioned toward the stairwell. They slipped out, one by one, into the maze of shelves. They were nearly past the tool racks when the lights shut off. All of them. A snap, then black. The rain roared louder. Somewhere behind them, metal clanged. A scream, then a crash. A burst of steam hissed from the direction of the boiler. Pipes groaned, then split with a violent wrench. Water poured from overhead as the fire suppression lines failed, raining down with the same rhythm as the storm outside. Shadows moved above the rafters, and in the chaos, something stepped down from the mezzanine. It was massive, drenched. Eyes like burnished gold reflecting the flashing emergency lights. It didn't run. It didn't roar. It watched. And then it moved, calm, deliberate. It grabbed the steel lever near the heating tanks and yanked it hard. Scalding water burst from the line and doused the boiler. The pressure dropped instantly, enough to prevent what might have been an explosion. Screams rose again. Russell and his men stumbled out of the hallway, soaked, cursing. One of them slipped and hit the concrete with a wet slap. Tessa raised her recorder again. Russell yelled, "What the hell is that?" The figure stood above them on the loading platform, lit by the strobing emergency lights. Steam rose from its shoulders. Its fur slicked flat. It didn't move. Russell turned to one of his men. "Shoot it!" But the gun never left the holster. The warehouse door flew open with the wind, and in stepped Sheriff Walt Hargrove, his badge soaked through, Trat Com Gzit folded in one hand like a sword. "Put your hands where I can see them, Bane." Russell turned, eyes wide. "You can't. This is private property." "Not anymore. You forged state permits, altered protected maps, and bribed officials. We have the audio." Tessa stepped out, recorder still blinking. Russell lunged for her, but something moved between them, fast, a wall of fur and breath and silence. Russell froze, staring up into a face that was neither beast nor man. Amber eyes locked onto his. Then it stepped aside. No sound, just space. Lorraine stepped forward, her voice clear in the thunder. "You took from this land, lied about what lived here. You tried to burn it out, but it remembered." Russell didn't speak. Walt snapped cuffs on him, pulled his arms behind his back. One by one, the others followed. And the creature disappeared, back into the smoke and steam. No footprints, no farewell, just gone. Outside, the storm began to break. The rain lightened, the wind died. Lorraine stood in the doorway, hand on Evan's shoulder. He had followed her inside without permission, without fear. And now, he looked up into the empty rafters like he expected to see someone watching. Maybe he did. That night the warehouse stood hollow, and in the silence after the storm, the forest listened. Because it knew now, someone had spoken for it, and someone had heard. By morning the sky had cleared like it knew it had something to make up for. Thin gold light spilled across the Trinity Basin in long beams, washing over rooftops still dripping from the storm. Smoke no longer rose from Russell lumber. Only steam now, rising from damp concrete as the sun pressed through the remnants of night. Lorraine stood barefoot on her porch, wrapped in Bill's old flannel robe. Her coffee sat untouched on the railing beside her. She wasn't watching the street or the neighbors hosing down their driveways. She was listening to what didn't speak in words, to the forest beyond the ridge, silent now, but not empty. The news broke just after 8. Sheriff Hargrove walked Russell Bane out in cuffs, past the crew of reporters called in overnight by Tessa and her mysterious contact. Not just local, statewide. Some said federal might follow. Charges ranged from permit fraud to illegal logging, obstruction, and, though carefully worded, multiple counts of endangerment tied to undeclared explosive materials stored in proximity to active machinery. The press didn't care about the creature. Not yet. But something had shifted in the town. Pastor Elena opened the chapel doors early. Not for prayer, but for conversation. Marta led the first meeting on community conservation efforts, calling for a fund to reclaim the damaged forest land. to protect what couldn't be spoken aloud in meetings or news articles. They didn't say the word Bigfoot. They didn't have to. They gave it a name anyway. The Valley of Quiet Hands. By noon, someone had hung a handmade sign along the trail entrance above Hennessy Creek, carved from fallen pinewood. No markings, just those words burned in deep. Leave no trace. Not all things want to be found. Lorraine watched the whole day unfold with the stillness of someone who had already lived through the storm. Her body moved slow but certain, like something inside her had finally stopped bracing for the next hit. She didn't speak of the cave again, or the figure that had stared down Russell in the warehouse. But that night, just after the air cooled and the scent of damp grass returned, she found something on her porch, not left out in the open, placed, set with care, a brass button, polished to a shine, resting atop a folded piece of dark canvas. Wool, worn, familiar. She knew it by the threadwork along the hem. Bill's old mailbag strap, the one she thought she'd buried with him. She didn't cry, but she sat on the steps until well after the sun dipped behind the trees. Just sat there with her hand over the button, her thumb tracing the grooves of the eagle again and again. And when the porch light flickered just once, she looked up toward the woods. No shape stood there, but something had passed through. Evan had gone out earlier that day, just after breakfast, a basket of blueberries in his hand. He hadn't asked permission. He hadn't needed to. Lorraine had watched him disappear up the old game trail, his boots kicking up dust, his small frame swallowed by the green. He came back an hour later, cheeks flushed, lips stained. He didn't say much, but when she asked where the basket was, he said, "I left it where we traded berries, where the quiet is." She didn't press. He didn't lie. And later that evening, as dusk painted the treetops pink, he stood at the edge of the property, staring into the mist that always seemed to settle in the same hollow just west of the ridge. That's when he saw them. Two shapes, taller than any man, walking side by side across the clearing. One larger, broader, moving with the slow, careful gait of something still healing. The other leaner, younger, head tilted slightly back like it was smelling the sky. They didn't look at him. They didn't wave. But they paused just long enough for the light to catch on their fur, to glint against the strands of moss and rain still clinging to their backs. And then they slipped away, swallowed by the fog without a sound. He didn't run inside. He didn't call for anyone. He just stood there for a long while, hand clenched gently around the carving in his pocket, the one shaped like an acorn, warm now from the heat of his palm. In town, the storefronts were still damp, but the windows had been wiped clean. Elena walked the sidewalks with a clipboard, asking for donations, not signatures. The townsfolk nodded more than they used to. Slower, quieter. They didn't ask about the sounds at night, or the shadows that moved across the ridgeline. They just left the trees alone. A week later, Abel returned to the place he once wronged. The stump was still there, ragged and hollow. Moss had grown up its sides like a wound halfway closed. He brought with him a sapling, young, trembling, barely a whisper of the giant it might one day become. He knelt slowly, his injured leg stiff beneath him, and planted it without speaking. No prayer, no promise, just a single hand pressed to the earth as he rose. "It won't fix it," he muttered, "but maybe it'll be a start." And maybe the forest would decide what to forgive. By nightfall, the stars had come out clear for the first time in weeks. Lorraine lay in bed, the window cracked open just enough to let in the scent of pine. Crickets chirped in uneven rhythm. A breeze stirred the curtains. Then it came, soft and certain, one knock, far, faint, not urgent, not calling her to follow. Just a presence, just a farewell, a reminder that silence could be sacred, and not all kindness needed to speak. She smiled in the dark. Her fingers curled around the polished button now hanging from a leather cord beside the bed. She whispered into the air, "Good night, friend." And somewhere out beyond the hills, past the creek and the basin and the old trail with no name, something answered, not with a sound, but with stillness and peace. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. The ones where no spotlight shines, no hero rises with thunder, and no victory is shouted from rooftops. Just people listening, just hearts opening, just the woods breathing in time with those who learn how to be still. This was never about monsters or legends. Not really. It was about the space between fear and wonder, about what happens when we stop trying to explain everything and start remembering what it means to be part of something older than our names, older than our buildings, older than our fences. There are places in this world that don't belong to us, not because they're hidden, not because they're too wild to be tamed, but because they are sacred in ways our language doesn't quite touch. We build borders, laws, and stories to feel in control. But nature keeps its own truths. It offers them not with noise or pride, but through silence, ritual, and trust earned slowly, breath by breath. At the heart of this tale was never a question of what is real. The deeper question, the only one that ever mattered, was, will we choose to see what's right in front of us, even if it asks us to change? And if we're brave enough to look, what kind of world might we help heal? Because sometimes compassion looks like doing nothing at all. Sometimes love means keeping a secret. And sometimes the most human thing we can do is protect something we'll never fully understand, simply because we can. In the end, the forest keeps its rhythm. It remembers those who tread softly. It watches those who listen. And when it chooses to answer, it does so not with thunder, but with one quiet knock, like a friend saying goodbye, or perhaps, thank you. If this story found you in a quiet place in your life, or stirred something you didn't expect, we're grateful you came along for the journey. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you, what lingered in your heart, or what you saw between the lines. Every voice matters in a story like this. If you'd like to walk deeper into the woods with us again, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have many more paths to explore, and we'd be honored to have you by our side. Thank you for listening, and wherever you are tonight, may the forest know your name.